Linda started with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in 1992 and started in pin computing and voice recognition technologies. However, very quickly, we discovered Linda's capabilities in software development, so we got her to start with the very beginning of ResCheck and then ComCheck afterwards. So one of the original developers, and since then she's become the manager of all of our software tools, every variation of ResCheck and ComCheck that I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with. However, I was very pleased that Linda agreed to take on the Strawman activity, and that's what the focus this afternoon is going to be on the talk that she's going to be giving. It's hugely exciting in terms of really starting to focus on compliance. So Linda and her team at the lab will hear about that, and then we're going to hear from some of the panel members shortly thereafter. So Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you. Okay. Thanks.
So everyone expects you to be able to change your slideshow really quick if you're a computer. I can do it. All right, this looks like it. Okay, yeah.
Linda, pull the mic towards you. Thank you so much. I'm back here. I'm back here. See, I'm talking to you back here. Hi, how you doing?
I'm
Good
a
to see ya.
Recognition. No, it's sight. I didn't do the visualization part of that. Anyway, I'm glad to get the apology about being left off. This talk is somewhat controversial, and I thought maybe that was intentional in case this didn't go real well. Then they could have nothing in writing that claims I'm part of the program. I also, you'll see that this is about the code compliance measurement portion of the Recovery Act, and I didn't get the memo about it being changed because of the AARP problem with the acronym, so this still says ARRA, so didn't get that updated, but we will fix that. This is a panel, and so I'm going to start off with some information about some of the work that the Building Codes program is doing to help develop tools and procedures that the states can use and adapt for measuring compliance in the states and local jurisdictions. Following that, we're going to have some guest speakers also in this session. And the first one will be Eric Makala, and Eric has spent over 20 years working in residential and commercial energy efficiency and codes and standards. He was served as the training coordinator for the Building Energy Codes program, so he used to work for PNNL back in the old days. He was the senior educational programs administrator for the ICBO, and he has trained or presented on codes in over 22 states. He has co-managed residential and commercial energy code baseline studies in Nevada, Iowa, and Indiana. And that's the main factor of why he's here talking to us, because those studies have a lot to do with measuring compliance in the states. He also served on the IECC Development Committee, which included the development of the 2009 IECC. Following Eric is Mike DeWine, who's going to speak to us, and Mike has served as the technical director for the BECP program since 1995 and has provided technical support and direction to BECP and its programs in over 35 states. His current projects include the development of the Advanced Energy Codes, training and outreach programs for state and municipalities. He's worked as a technical specialist at the New York State Energy Office, and he assisted in developing and was the first trainer for the New York STAR program, which was one of the earlier HERS programs. He's here today going to be talking about two roundtables that he has through BECP and through the Energy Foundation put on that pertain to measuring compliance in the states. And so he's going to present the discussion and findings from those roundtables. So not only did Diana forget me, but she also stole my quote in her introductory slides, which was from the New York Times article that came out just this month, and that claimed energy building codes are the single biggest opportunity to save the environment while saving the consumer money. It went on to say that no single policy change could do more to save energy over the long run than building codes that make saving energy the law. And the law is kind of a good segue into this session, because I know we've all seen laws that were not enforced and that aren't very meaningful. So you've probably all seen the Recovery Act legislation. This is just a quick summary in case anyone hasn't. Of the 3 items listed in there that the states will do, one of them is divided into 3 parts, and that is adopting the most recent residential code, the 2009 IECC, and also ASHRAE Standard 90.1 2007, and develop a plan to achieve 90% compliance within 8 years, include active training and enforcement in that plan, and an annual measurement. So these are, that last bullet is the part we're focusing on in this session. And these are 2 wordings of that legislation. The top one was in the Recovery Act itself, and then the State Energy Program funding opportunity had similar legislation, but as you can see, it's much shorter, looks more like a summary of what the original legislation said. And I only bring this up to kind of point out the part in red that says the 90% is in new and renovated residential and commercial building space. That part of the legislation has had some impact in some of the decisions that we've come up with. So the objectives of the legislation itself, the Recovery Act is focused on creating jobs and retaining jobs. And the SEP has always been focused on reducing energy costs and consumption. And so even though a lot of our effort in developing tools has been how do you measure compliance in the states, we feel that this effort is about a lot more than just measuring. It's about improving compliance while we're out there, improving it through training and awareness, because the legislation does specifically cite training programs, through better enforcement, through process improvements at the local jurisdictions, and it will also involve increased manpower and therefore create jobs. For example, trainers and inspectors, evaluators, because what we are proposing is an evaluation of buildings in the field. We also feel it's a great opportunity to better understand the compliance rates in the states. You've heard a couple, including Sean's estimate of studies that talk about return on investment and talk about potential savings if the bar is raised in terms of compliance. Those are guesses. It's pretty hard to know exactly what the compliance rates are in the states. This is also an opportunity to understand where code requirements are a barrier, actually, where they're not working, where maybe the code itself needs enhancement in order to make it more understandable. There's code requirements that perhaps just aren't well understood that could be enhanced, or that just aren't enforceable. So this is a chart I pulled from an Oak Ridge study, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which they did on the State Energy Program. This is for the year 2002. The report came out in 2005. I brought it up to show you what this first chart shows is the expenditures by states in the SEP program. On these, they divided the activities in the program into these various categories. And so the codes and standards came out 7th in terms of how much money was spent on that activity. Note that workshops and training came out 2nd. And then the second graph shows the estimated annual savings from those activities. So you notice that codes and standards came in 2nd in terms of estimated annual savings, and workshops and training came in 1st, even though neither of those were the first, had the most money spent on them. In fact, codes and standards was number 7. I just bring this up to show that these two programs both are very much a part of what we're talking about when we're talking about measuring compliance in the states, and that they do, at least according to this study, have a major impact. The Building Codes program has some objectives also in the work that they're doing for measuring code compliance. That includes to foster uniformity across the states when they're endeavoring to measure code compliance. That uniformity is not only important in in having a comparison of apples to apples when those numbers are reported, but it's also important if the data is gathered right. There's a whole lot of additional information we can gain, but we have to make sure that it's gathered in a way that it makes sense across states, regions, climate zones. We also wanted to eliminate the need for states to have to start from scratch in this effort. Quite frankly, a lot of the studies I've looked at, I bet a good portion of the effort going into those studies was figuring out a methodology for how to do this. And so we hope to provide that methodology and tools for states to use if they choose, and to adapt to their own use if they choose. And then we also hope that we can help enable the collection of additional data that would be very useful to the program, to the country, in looking at code compliance. So activities to date. We started out by reviewing a lot of studies on measuring code compliance. There are actually not an overwhelming number, but they're all very large. They're about this thick. And after reviewing those, we came out with what we called our Strawman version 1, and that was released in March of 2009. We sent that out for public review, not public review, we sent it out to stakeholders. It was a somewhat limited distribution. We tried to include all states. We included some other industry stakeholders, the code organizations, and we asked for feedback on that. It was sort of just an effort to get a document out there and to pulse people to see what they thought. That first document proposed a 3-tier approach to measuring compliance. The first 2 tiers were very focused on surveying the jurisdictions, so looking at how much training the inspectors have in energy codes, what's the level of plan review that they do, do they require compliance documentation to be submitted when they're submitting for a permit. And then our 3rd tier was all about measuring compliance in the buildings in the field. And by the way, in my presentation, some of the feedback we got on early on was that terms like auditor and inspector were somewhat, they had connotations that maybe were not, that we didn't want to use. Auditor, like an IRS auditor, that's kind of a negative connotation. Inspector, we think of in terms of the code officials, and those might not be the folks that are actually doing the evaluation in the field. So in this presentation, we're decided to use the word evaluator and evaluations. Means pretty much the same thing. All right, so the feedback we got on that was that even though evaluating the process that the jurisdictions are using is valuable, the Recovery Act will require evaluation of buildings to see if they comply with the code. And by the way, we looked at some existing programs such as ISO's Building Codes Effectiveness Grading Scale, and we looked at some studies done with telephone surveys, and those are all based on rating jurisdictions based on these types of surveys. So we do feel there's value in that. But by and large, the feedback came back that we really needed to evaluate the buildings. Also that came back was we should involve the design and construction industry in this, and the build community in this effort, that we should not just focus on the jurisdictions and the jurisdictional staff, that we should provide training to include training in corrective measures that we find that uniformly there's certain code requirements that are not met in the field, focus our training on those, and follow up as part of the process. And the feedback said that the building codes program should provide detailed methodologies which would help ensure national uniformity and comparability of results. And by the way, this first Strawman was very high level, so there was not a lot of detail in it. So based on that feedback, we came out with a second Strawman Revision 2, and that was released just in June. It was significantly revised to focus on the evaluation of buildings in the field. It was sent out to a broader distribution, just about everyone we could think of that might have an interest in providing feedback. Like I said, it focused on an evaluation of a statistically valid sample of buildings in the field. It did continue to propose looking at the processes used in the jurisdictions as a possible way to do an annual measurement. It also recommends perhaps spot checks as a way to do annual measurement, because if you recall, the legislation says a plan to reach 90% within 8 years and annual measurement. And so it also purported that states need to show progress towards that 90% goal until that compliance is demonstrated. And then it stated that once the 90% compliance is demonstrated, there is no further need to continue there's no more requirement to continue measuring, at least within the Recovery Act. Now, the program recommends that that measurement continue because there's a lot of things that change in the jurisdictions. The officials change, the code in the state changes, the builders come and go, and some previous studies have shown that it's not always an upward swing you see within the jurisdiction. So there's no guarantee that once they reach 90%, that they're going to stay there. But because the Recovery Act is a one-time infusion of funds into this process, DOE didn't really feel justified in saying that once you meet that you would have to continue with the annual measurement. We also got some feedback that using building performance based on utility data would be a valuable way to measure compliance. And this, our second straw man, while we think that there's some valuable information in doing that, and some of the studies actually do look at that, we decided that it's outside the scope of this effort. The codes are mostly prescriptive. There is no real way to link a building's energy usage after it's built to the code. The occupant behavior, climate, type of building use, it's just, the correlation just isn't there. Nonetheless, we will have a section on related activities that might talk about ways that you could look at utility data, because it would be great to see how our buildings are performing in the field. So, we gathered all the feedback from the second straw man. A lot of it fell into categories or topics. And what we plan to do is to address each one of those topics. And these are the topics that kind of fell out from the feedback. We're coming up with what we're calling topic briefs for each one of these. The top 5, we're pretty much done with the detailed resolutions on these, and we'll be posting them online as we get the others done, which would be probably within a month. I would think most of them would be done. Those also will be posted online. We anticipate that these topic briefs will then roll into our final guidance. The feedback came back as some of them with suggestions on doing things this way or that way, and others, a lot of it was just questions, like provide more detail for this or that. So you'll find these topic briefs are a combination of justifying why we made decisions about certain things, and also clarification and more details into all the topics. So the first one was a rather controversial issue. It's how you measure the 90% compliance. And it pretty much fell into 2 camps. Now, these 2 methods that I'm going to describe, there's lots of variations on those, but at a high level, it really boiled down to these 2 methods. Method 1, a building passes or fails all the code requirements, and if it fails any of them, it fails. And then you must have 90% of your buildings evaluated pass in order to achieve 90%. Method 2 assigns a % compliance to each building and then averages those to come up with a compliance rate. If you look at my illustration at the bottom, this could be the same set of 10 houses. You can see where everyone that's not at exactly 100% under Method 1 fails, and under Method 2, those percentages assigned to each building are averaged. And you can see that this is a pretty impactful difference in the result. So our guidelines, which are, as I mentioned, voluntary, but they're going to come out and suggest that we use Method 2. And the reason we came up with that, there was really quite a number of reasons. One of them is we believe it provides a much truer understanding of the compliance rate in a state. You could have 2 states, and all of the buildings in one state could be very close to complying. They could be very good performing buildings, but maybe there was one code requirement that they just unilaterally missed. They would all fail, and that state would have a very low compliance rate. Compare that to a state that perhaps had very poor buildings that failed a lot of measures. They may have the same, those 2 states may have the same compliance rate, and we didn't believe that that really provided a true understanding of what's going on in that state. We also felt that there's a lot of subjective criteria in the code. It's not a fault necessarily of the code, but it's just part of the problem. And evaluators could go out and interpret a code requirement differently. And even though that's a problem in either methodology, if the whole building fails because some evaluator took a subjective criteria and said that building fails, that's pretty high penalty for something that's somewhat subjective. Whereas if they miss one code requirement, maybe that drops their percentage to 95% instead of 100. That has a lot less impact. There's some, in the topic brief that we published, there's some logistics that we felt method 2 better resolved. And we've also felt that the data completeness would be better with method 2. And what I mean by that is we didn't want evaluators going out there and hitting the first code infraction and saying, well, it fails, and stopping. We want to collect all the information about these buildings that are evaluated that we can. So here's a few examples of what I mentioned in the top. There's a code requirement in the IECC about equipment sizing. And it in turn refers to the IRC, which in turn says that you have to have ACCA calculations for equipment sizing. Now, we believe that a large number of buildings, especially residential buildings, will fail on this code requirement alone. It's not that it's a bad requirement. There's a lot of energy loss by improperly sized equipment, but failing buildings on this requirement alone is going to be problematic in terms of if you were to fail the entire building for that one reason. Another example of that is the fenestration, the NFRC labeling that's required for site-built windows now. We're told that in the commercial buildings that a lot of buildings would fail that because of problematic issues with having site-built fenestration labeled. And then in terms of the subjective criteria, everything installed according to manufacturer's instructions, that's a little bit subjective. The visual inspection of 12 of the caulking and sealing items. Yeah.
As far as the compliance, you say that you do an average of the items for the compliance and then average that into a 90%. If you do that, you have the risk of having important items not be compliant within the code, which would be a great loss. For example, if you have a measure, an energy-saving measure that would represent a 20% against the other small measures, and that's one of the the 70% or whatever, and then you average that, you say that you're 90% compliant, but...
Okay, I understand the question that some code requirements are much more impactful than others. That's a good segue because I do have a slide on that. We are intending to weight the requirements, I'm going to say I'm going to talk a lot today like this is the way it is. Please keep in mind this is our guidance, but we do intend to weight those items. So let me get to that slide that shows what we propose for that. So anyway, back to the subjective criteria, words like rigid, opaque, and weather resistant, or provide sufficient space, or durably seal, ducts shall be sealed, and restrict infiltration. These are all examples of criteria that are somewhat subjective. So we're now getting into topic brief 2, and there were actually 2 parts to this that dealt with above code programs. The first one was they wanted, one of the feedback was to include the impacts of above code buildings to sort of weigh out, to sort of leverage against the below code buildings. So for example, if you had 10 buildings that were 50% above code and 10 buildings that were 50% below code, those should be able to leverage those above code buildings and come up with a higher compliance metric. We're not going to recommend this as part of our policies or our guidelines. The reason is because this is about bringing buildings up to the baseline, which is the code. It's great when there's buildings being built above code, but it doesn't tell us anything about the opportunity to bring buildings up to code that we are missing. And so in that example where you got 50% above and 50% below, if you come back and report 100% compliance, that doesn't tell you anything about the opportunity to bring those 50% up to the baseline where they should be. It would also be very problematic in measuring how much above code a building was. So we're not going to recommend this. And the second part to this was to include and leverage building evaluations performed as part of above code voluntary programs, HERS, LEED, Energy Star. This is sort of a yes and no. Yes, we will try to leverage those programs wherever possible. If there's been, for example, a HERS inspection on a building and it's part of the sample set, we hope that maybe we can use some of the information that's already been gathered on that building. However, comparing a HERS home directly, a rating that a HERS home has directly with the IECC 2009 is very difficult, since HERS is based on the 2006 and the measurement is quite different, a quite different process. So we'll leverage it where we can. We're trying to work with some of the leaders in some of those programs to figure out ways that we can leverage the work that they're doing. Now, the sample size and makeup. This was a very popular question on the feedback. What will be the sample size? What will it look like? So before I start, are there any statisticians out here? What could you please leave? No, we do have a statistician on our team. That's not me, so I'm going to do the best I can to kind of present his results. Well, what's your confidence level? You're confidently not going to leave. Okay, well, we'll give it a shot. First of all, the sample size and makeup topic consists of, what populations are we sampling, what types of buildings, how is the sample size established, and what is the process for generating this sample, and also provisions for non-participation. Because what's been found in previous studies is you can't always get on the building to do the evaluation. Builders may fear some kind of retribution, or maybe they're too busy, they don't respond. So that probably needs to be incorporated into your sampling. So we came up with two populations. We feel that commercial buildings and residential buildings should be completely separate populations, and that commercial renovations will be included with commercial buildings and residential renovations will be included with residential. We'd like to see the samples distributed across the climate zones in the state. The sample should include subsets of building types and attributes. So, for example, in residential, you should get not only some residential renovations, but some single-family and multifamily. In commercial buildings, some simple commercial and complex commercial, varying building use types, and again, some renovations. So, our statistician, after a lot of work and bringing him up to what we're trying to accomplish, came up with a sample size of 44 commercial and 44 residential buildings in the state. We'd like to see these distributed across the climate zones, and so if this is a map of the climate zones, you'll see the worst case will be 5 climate zones for 2 of the states. Some of the states have only 1 climate zone, so there won't be any worries there. We will, by the way, assist with developing such a sample. We hope to have tools that will help develop the sample. The distribution across climate zones will be by activity based on building start information, permitting information, but we do think it's important to at least cover at a minimum a few samples in each climate zone, because the code requirements are different. Also then distributed across building jurisdictions within those climate zones. This doesn't mean every jurisdiction. That would be a huge task. But again, we'd look at building starts and activity and choose the largest jurisdictions. Yeah?
What would you do in the case of a state has adopted different climate zones than the one that are included in the IECC? There's an example, New Hampshire is an example of that.
Right, and they have how many climate zones that they've adopted?
They have 1 climate zone across the state.
Then I would say that's 1 climate zone. But, quite frankly, a lot of this is very detailed, and we anticipate working with states with their individual issues and problems, because no states are going to be alike in this. And so you have heard mention of some pilots. We're hoping in those pilots to get a lot of variation, maybe run 4 or 5 pilots that have different experiences, both in what their code enforcement is like, how many climate zones, and we will more hand-tune those sample sets for them and hopefully have a better feel for what works and what doesn't work with the other states. But I'm guessing that it'll be a lot of one-on-one with the state. So those samples will be randomized to have different building uses and attributes within those climate zones and jurisdictions. And we probably recommend that you increase that minimum size of 44 each because of non-participation. You're probably going to go out and get turned down on some of them, or it might be that you start with those 88 samples and then you have to go back and get a few more because of non-participation. The sample sizes, if you wanted to have an area with a statistically valid sample that was smaller than your state, you could do that if you increase the sample size within that area. And that might be of interest, because I know in some studies there were utility areas that were interested in having a statistically valid sample just within their utility area, and they put in some extra money in those studies, the utility did, to help fund the extra samples. So it could even be someone, in New York, and New York City wanted to have its own statistically valid results. They could do 88 samples in New York City alone, and then that would be considered valid. Otherwise, the information reported on jurisdictions and cities within the state are not valid in terms of, you can't look at those and say that's a statistically valid result. So we anticipate working with states to modify the samples where needed, and there is the potential for needing more samples if the state variation is too high. And let me explain what that means. This is a curve showing the sample size on the x-axis and what they call the standard deviation on the y, which is impacted by how much the spread of the resulting measurements are. And so we chose a fairly conservative deviation with 44 samples, and this shows some histograms of the spread that would still fit within that amount of deviation. And you can see that they're pretty spread out, probably more so than you'd find in most states. However, if the deviation gets too high, then your ability to say that you have a certain confidence in your result becomes worse. And so in cases where if the results came back and they were all over the board and they didn't fall, they required more samples, you might have to go out and take a few more samples. Yeah.
If a state goes up and checks 44 buildings, and half of them don't qualify and are less, they pick another half, another 22, and those meet. So each state is going to come up with 44 or 88 with commercial and residential, and there's no state that's going to say we have not met the 90% compliance.
Well, you're not exactly allowed to take the results and then only redo the ones that failed. And so that is actually another topic that's coming up, and thankfully I'm not ready to address that one yet, but we do think that if you take if for example in my example with New York, if New York City did its sample and raised it, and it's not really 44 buildings, it's 88 because 44 residential and 44 commercial. If New York City did their 88 samples and passed and the rest of New York failed, we probably would call New York City, we probably could carry that over. How all that works out, we haven't really decided, but you certainly cannot just choose the ones that fail and redo them. That wouldn't work. Yes?
Question on commercial. Regarding commercial, have you taken building square footage or building size into account?
Yes, and that's coming up.
Thank you.
So, one nice thing about the data, we actually hope that we can collect in a national database some of the results, including we're trying to collect values, not just pass-fail on code items. What's the insulation R value in the walls? If this information is put in a database, we hope to provide tools that can give you alternative measurements. So, for example, method 1, which I mentioned, we could go back and compute what that state would have under method 1, even though that's not the method we're proposing. Might make an interesting comparison. Yes, someone's...
I have a question about drawing the sample. It is. Do I need, if we, I'm assuming that you're planning on states using, or the jurisdictions using their database of permits issued in a whatever time frame you're looking at. What if there is no permitting process? In other words, what if there's literally no database of construction starts?
Right. I'm going to get to that too, just briefly. That is an issue that we recognize. We've read it in other studies. I'm getting a little low on time, so if you'd hold your questions, I'm going to try to get through the important slides so I can get these other speakers up. So I wanted to go a little bit into the checklist that we're developing, because that's the other important piece of this. The code requirements on the checklist, one of the big questions was, should we include all code requirements or should we just include the high impact requirements? Our recommendation as a program was that we should allow checklists that only have the high impact requirements, and I'll define that in a minute. However, there was a lot of controversy over that, so since we're developing these checklists, we are also going to include checklists that have all code requirements, and I'll get to that in a minute too. They need to support the various building strata. They need to support the phases of construction. They need to support the various compliance approaches that are available, and they need to capture the criteria, the values that pertain to the criteria out there, and the comments that the evaluators have. So one thing I wanted to let you know is that the program does intend to help the states ingest this information electronically, because a lot of this probably will be done on paper, although we hope to provide these checklists on Excel spreadsheets as well. So as for all code requirements versus the high impact, we took a look at the ASHRAE documentation for prescriptive compliance. It was 13 pages. The IECC plan review form, 12 pages. This is a lot of work to do for a single building. They're very nicely done compliance forms, don't get me wrong. It's just that that's asking an awful lot of the states. These are some examples of checklists. So what we decided to do was divide the requirements into 3 tiers. Tier 1 is what we're calling high impact, but it's more than just the ones that have the most impact on energy use. It also includes known compliance problems and includes items that were newly introduced in the target codes. We're also saying that if, you know, the Tier 1 requirements must be on the checklist. Those have to be complied against. Tier 2 items, which are a little less impactful than Tier 1, and Tier 3 even less so. The states can choose from those if they want to add those to their checklist. Maybe there's something they know in their state that's a problem. And then they can also choose to make those checklists full checklists. They can have all of Tier 1, 2, and 3 if they want. The pilot studies we hope we get a mixed use of some of the checklists with just Tier 1 and some of the full checklists, and that we can come back to you and tell you how long it takes an evaluator to complete these. So the weighting that I mentioned, we plan to weight the Tier 1 items by 3, the Tier 2 items by 2, and the Tier 3 items by 1. The calculation is based on the number of items inspected or the number of items passed divided by the number of items inspected, and these are weighted. So if you have 2 items from Tier 1, those are a total of 6, and if you failed one of those items, you get 3 out of 6, you'd be at 50%. Now, obviously, there are a lot bigger checklists than that. We do plan to average the metric by building space. The commercial building sample set will attempt to choose, we're going to try to find the medium commercial office size through our Dodge data, and choose an equal number of buildings that are larger and smaller than that average, so that we're not all focused on small buildings or large. And by the way, it was unclear to us on our team whether adding more items would be advantageous or not. The extra items you might add to a checklist have less impact than the Tier 1 items, and you're also dividing by those extra items. So it's really unclear that this provides any kind of advantage or disadvantage, and that's why we felt you could actually compare the results even though the checklist may not be the same size. All right, well, I better turn this over to, let me look really quick. Just 1 minute. The hook. Huh? That's okay, the hook. The hook. Okay, here's a picture of checklists that we plan to put out. It's still very draft, but you will see it's in inspection stages. The only other thing I wanted to mention was that we're going to allow multiple samples or multiple buildings to be used for a single sample. So you will see repeated here a conditioned floor area at each stage. This is a plan check. If they needed to go to a different building for foundation, it needed to be a comparable building, commercial, same size, approximately same size, but that they could do that. And this was to allow, for example, on residential, going to a tract housing development where maybe there's a lot of buildings out there at different stages of development. Instead of having to go back to that building each time to check the foundation and then the insulation and then the lighting, you might be able to gather that information from different buildings. So with that, I better turn it over to...
Aaron's got a question.
Okay.
Linda, on your team, was there a building official, a certified building official, or a master code official on your team, your lab team?
We have sort of. Sort of. We have people that have worked as with ICC and with ICBO, and we also we admitted, we're more than willing to admit that we don't have all the experience that the building officials and the builders and the industry have, and that is why we have sent it out twice now for feedback. It did go to the code bodies for feedback, and we did get some back from them. But yes, we do have 2 members of the team that have. One of them's worked for ICC. Eric, who I introduced, has been helping with feedback on these items. So we do have some input.